This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So welcome to the Edwards to Gulf LCD demonstration webinar. Many of you are probably at least somewhat familiar with the project, but I'm briefly going to go over the LCD and its associated decision support tools to make sure we're all on the same page before launching into the demonstration projects. So the Edwards to Gulf LCD was funded and initiated by the Gulf Coast Prairie LCC. The goal of the project was to develop a fine filter conservation blueprint that improved upon the level of detail of the existing coarse filter blueprint, but focusing on a high priority region within the broader Gulf Coast Prairie LCC territory. It was also intended to generate a common vision for the Edwards to Gulf region that would facilitate cooperation between partners, agencies, and organizations, and to meet stakeholder needs in a way that ensured the LCD's utility into the future. So this is our project area. The geographic bounds range from the Edwards Plateau in the northwest to the Gulf of Mexico in the southeast, and include the lower Colorado, Guadalupe, and San Antonio River watersheds. The conservation targets of this project consist of a group of habitats that were originally defined by the Gulf Coast Prairie LCC in a rather general sense. They include floodplain forests, freshwater wetlands, major rivers, rice agriculture, tallgrass prairie, and tidal wetlands. Of these, tallgrass prairie may be a bit misleading as it includes all potential grasslands, except for semi-desert shrublands in the southwestern portion of the region. It'll be in this area, and you'll see that gap in some of the maps we look at later with the demonstration projects. So we developed decision support tools for each of the conservation targets, those broadly defined habitats. The foundational element of these tools are the ecological integrity ratings. They consist of three main components shown here: habitat amount and connectivity, human development, and habitat quality. Habitat amount and connectivity includes three different indicators, and these are the same for all terrestrial habitats. The indicators we use are aggregated at the resolution of 200-meter reporting units, which amounts to pixels of about 10 acres in size. So that's what you see here with this percent cover. Percent cover is the percent cover of habitat within each reporting unit. We also include percent landscape, which is the percent cover of habitat at a 1 kilometer radius, and the mean patch size that could expand indefinitely, determining on the size of patches that intersect each reporting unit. All the indicators of human development are calculated within that 1 kilometer radius. And human development includes things like road density, energy infrastructure density, and percent cover of developed or agricultural land. For rivers, instead of using that 1 kilometer radius, we use adjacent HUC-12 subwatersheds to calculate any of these indicators that are calculated at a 1 kilometer radius for terrestrial habitat. This illustration here kind of gives you an example of that real quick. You have a 200-meter reporting unit in the center, and then that 1 kilometer radius, and various different patches of habitat intersecting different levels of that. So that's just to kind of give you a quick overview of how habitat amount and connectivity and low human development are calculated and feed into ecological integrity ratings. Habitat quality is a more site-level metric that generally consists of a combination of focal species indicators and vegetation or hydrologic indicators. Here we're showing the indicators used for tallgrass prairie habitat quality. Vegetation quality takes a mean value from woody cover, herbaceous quality, and fire return interval, while focal species habitat suitability takes the highest value of the potential focal species. All of these indicators in orange are calculated on their own based on their own thresholds and then converted to a -1 to +1 scale that allows them to all be combined into these higher level indicators. And so with the habitat suitability for focal species, we take the highest value because in any given 10-acre patch, obviously we're only, it's too much to expect to meet the needs of all the focal species at that scale. So we're trying to meet those needs at a larger scale. And so within these reporting units, it takes the highest value. For vegetation quality, it takes a mean value because it is looking at all those different components at that finer scale there. Oh, before I move on, you can get all the details on these models from our website. We have very detailed manuals on how the models were developed and how all the indicators were processed. So you can get into all the really nitty-gritty stuff in those manuals. The main products of the LCD are habitat protection rankings and habitat management rankings. Habitat management rankings include a breakdown of maintenance and restoration rankings that prioritize maintaining habitat that is already in good condition or restoring habitat that is in a degraded state. Both products are modeled in similar ways and are largely dependent on ecological integrity ratings. However, they also take into consideration the degree of threats faced, conservation opportunities, and landscape scale ecological factors. Here we'll go over an example of what a protection ranking model may look like. So you have your ecological integrity rating for the habitat, and then you also have threat rankings, which can include urban development, subdivision, or water withdrawal risk. There are other threats that we include for other habitats as well. Then there are the opportunity rankings, which for the protection models include parcel density, partner interest, and land costs. For management models, instead of land costs, since we're not actually interested in acquiring the land for management necessarily, instead of land costs, we use incentive program participation, which includes number of acres enrolled in relevant EQIP practices, or in Texas Parks and Wildlife or U.S. Fish and Wildlife programs like LIP and the Partners Program. Landscape rankings include the mean value of ecological integrity ratings at the subwatershed scale for both terrestrial habitats and major rivers. We included both indicators for each type of habitat in an effort to link management and protection of rivers and uplands. Regional connectivity is an indicator that reflects the results of circuitscape analyses we conducted to model the potential flow of organisms between core areas and between protected areas. We use this approach because it's important to maintain connectivity between protected areas, but much of the region is in private land, so we also wanted to prioritize connectivity between important core patches of habitat that aren't officially protected. Basically, what you're seeing with that regional connectivity indicator there is a value of the current flowing through any given 10-acre patch. In other words, what are the odds that this patch of grassland will be used by some grassland-dependent species to move between core or protected areas? So that was a real quick overview of how the models are structured. And I'm doing it quickly because we're going to show you how they actually work in practice, and I think you'll learn more from that. So this was just kind of get everyone on the same page, make sure you understand the basics of it. Does anyone have any questions before we move forward to the next stage? All right. So before we get to the demonstration projects, I also want to show you how you can access the products. So if you go to our website, which is located at edwards2gulflcd.wp.txstate.edu, you find our page. You can also just Google Edwards to Gulf Conservation Blueprint. And if you click up here on the Conservation Blueprint tab, takes you to this page, which has links and descriptions of all the different spatial product decision support tools. This first link here takes you to the main gallery for the blueprint on Databasin. And that's what this gallery looks like here. And you don't have to have an account with Databasin. You can just go straight to the site, not worry about creating an account or anything, and you can open up these galleries. And when you open them up, here's an example of the floodplain forest ecological integrity page. And then you click on Open Map here, and it'll load up our ecological integrity rating products for floodplain forest. And you can zoom in, zoom out, move all over the map, look at whatever you want to look at. And you can do all this without having an account on Databasin. You can also open the Layers tab over here on the left, and you can view all the various indicators that go into generating these ecological integrity ratings. Now, if you want to actually conduct any serious analyses based on the output of our models, you're going to have to download the rasters that are shown here, and then open them in ARC or whatever GIS you use to conduct those analyses. So if you go back to the gallery page, there's a download tab here. Now, this is something you do need to have an account for. I don't think Databasin allows people without accounts to actually download the data. So you can create an account. It's free, pretty straightforward. And then you can download the raster package for any of the different outputs we have on Databasin there. That'll let you do most of what you would want to do. I think that should allow you to do everything we're going to show in the demonstration projects here. But just in case there's anything else you need, we have a more complete data set in the form of geodatabases at the bottom of our conservation blueprint site. So if you go to this page, at the bottom of this page, there's a link to our science-based page. And there you can get the metadata and the geodatabases that just have everything on them. All right, so let's get to the demonstration projects. The first demonstration project is for the Colorado River Land Trust. They already have their own prioritization maps for acquiring land within the immediate Colorado River Basin, but they were interested in acquiring land within the greater Matagorda Bay watershed, shown over here on the right as well, where they don't yet have any prioritization tools. This is a fairly straightforward task, but it includes a step that will probably be of interest to many stakeholders, combining the results of each habitat ranking together so that you can make decisions regardless of habitat type. So the way we created these models, everything's broken up by habitat. So if you want to look at all the habitats together, that's not something you can just pull up and automatically look at. So this is going to show you how you can do that, though. So the first step is to download the raster packages for each terrestrial habitat protection ranking. The goal here for the land trust is to buy land, so we're using those protection rankings instead of, say, management rankings. Then we use Mosaic to new raster and ArcGIS to combine all habitats together. We set the operator to maximum, which means that the highest ranking cell is used in any cell where multiple habitats overlap. So whatever habitat has the highest ranking in an overlapping cell, it's going to pick that habitat and put that value in there. Then we clip that new raster by the watershed boundaries, and we set the raster to display by quintiles. This is the general approach we used for prioritizing management and protection, is to just break it up into the bottom 20% all the way up to the top 20%. So that the highest fifth of any given habitat or all habitats would be very high priority, and it would go down from there based on those quintiles. So this is what you get, although this is displayed a little differently. the process I just described would actually prioritize land only within this watershed boundary here. It doesn't reflect prioritizations at the scale of the whole LCD geography. That process would just show you the prioritizations just here within this watershed. What you see here on this map is shown is the scale is a little different. We're actually using the rankings from the entire geography. So we first displayed those rankings from the entire pilot geography and used the breakpoints between each quintile to delineate priority levels here when displaying this clipped raster. What that means is here you see the regional scale rankings rather than rankings specific to what exists only within this subset of watersheds. So this is really just a matter of end user preference. So are you interested in what's considered high priority habitat at the scale of the LCD, or are you explicitly focused on prioritizing habitat within the bounds of your project only? So in this case, what you're seeing is what is very high priority habitat for the whole LCD, not just within this watershed. But it's really easy to switch between the two based on how you display those quantiles. So that's basically the first demonstration there. This is the output that we sent to the Colorado River Land Trust. And you can see there's these very high priority areas up in this northwest section over here, and then in the southwest, and then also along the Colorado River and getting into the Columbia bottomlands. Does anyone have any questions about the first demonstration project? I think there's a, there should be a button where you can raise your hand or something, or just speak up if you want. If you're, all right. Did anyone say anything? I just missed it. My speakers were having an issue for a second there.
I didn't hear anything, Brian. I don't think you missed anything.
All right, thanks. Going to go ahead and move forward. So this is the next project, the next demonstration. This one we did purely as a hypothetical example. We're not actually working with Kinder Morgan on this project in any way, just to be clear. We included it though because it does provide a unique example of guiding development away from important habitat rather than directly protecting or managing habitat. So the idea here is to identify the route of least impact within this 3-mile wide potential zone that the pipeline may go through. So again, we download in Mosaic the relevant rasters. In this case, it's the terrestrial ecological integrity rating. So those are separate again for each habitat. So we download each raster pack and then use Mosaic to new raster to create a new raster that combines them all using that maximum operator again. And then we clip that raster by the potential pipeline zone because that's all we're really interested in. And then the next step was something a little different here, just because floodplain forests and freshwater wetlands are types of habitat that aren't really possible to restore after pipeline installation, whereas in theory, at least, you could restore grasslands after the installation of the pipeline. We decided to prioritize avoiding them more than other habitats. So these are the steps here. We did this by using a combination of raster calculator and zonal statistics to basically double the value of ecological integrity ratings for floodplain forests and freshwater wetlands. So what we're doing here is basically all the outputs for our models are on that -1 to +1 scale. So we can't double it effectively. So that's why we just use Raster calculator here to add +1 to all of those values so that they're just all on a positive scale. And then we had to use zonal statistics to calculate a sum for each raster within each reporting unit. And we did that because Raster calculator only looks at where all 3 rasters have data. So there's a lot of places where the freshwater wetland layer, for instance, doesn't have any data. And so it would remove all those areas from the end output. So that wouldn't work for us. So we had to use zonal statistics to calculate the sum instead. And then we use Raster calculator again to combine all 3 of those sum rasters generated by zonal statistics. I don't know how in the weeds this is for a lot of you. I'm not sure how much people are used to using GIS or not. But as far as, you know, getting someone, I'm assuming most organizations and agencies have someone whose job it is to do this kind of stuff. And so these are the kinds of processes they would go through to do any, you know, of these more kind of serious analyses with our products. Anyway, after that, you take that new raster, and the idea is to create a resistance grid that can be input into linkage mapper. So this resistance grid we create by reclassifying that new raster, and we reclassified it by quintiles to a range of 10 to 50, and those are the resistance values. And so what that's doing is a value of 10 is low resistance, and we're assigning that to the bottom quintile of habitat ecological integrity ratings. So what that means is the lowest quality habitat is going to give the least resistance to guiding the path of that pipeline. And the highest quality habitat is going to be the highest resistance, and so hopefully the pipeline will avoid those areas. And then we had to create endpoints for the pipeline. Linkage mapper requires 2 inputs, a resistance grid and a core area shapefile. And so for us, the core area is just the endpoints of that 3-mile buffer zone. And so we use some buffering and erasing to just create those endpoints and then input that into linkage mapper. And this is what that looks like. So this is the input. You have the endpoints here, which are your core area input for linkage mapper. And then you have the resistance grid, which is based on ecological integrity ratings with an emphasis on freshwater wetlands and floodplain forests. So you can kind of see that here and here where there's some floodplain forest segments that are really dark, showing the extra importance to avoiding them as best as possible. And this is what the output looks like. So the red line here is the ideal route of least impact, which is just basically a least cost path between the 2 endpoints. And then the black to white gradient here is showing the broader resistance values. So basically just helping prioritize where that pipeline could go if it can't get exactly to that red line. Obviously, the red line is pretty jerky and probably not what a real pipeline is going to look like in any way. So you can use these white areas to guide it to the extent that it can't meet that least cost path. And then the black areas are places to be avoided because they represent higher ecological integrity, basically. And this is what the ideal route for the pipeline looks like over the ecological integrity ratings themselves. And so you can see there's some overlap there between these big green patches of higher quality habitat with these darker areas where pipeline construction should be avoided. And that's basically how you can use our tools to make recommendations for environmental impact analyses or assessments on development, trying to avoid high priority areas with ecological value. Does anyone have any questions about the pipeline demo?
Brian, did you say you used linkage mapper?
Yeah.
Okay.
So linkage mapper uses CircuitScape. It's basically just a toolbox you can download for free and install in ARC and then use that. And it uses CircuitScape to basically map connectivity between the areas, and then it calculates a least cost path based on those values. And that's what this gradient is here. The higher value is the higher resistance value, basically. So just a way to kind of map that. This is kind of an inversion of what we would normally use it for. And you'll see in the next demonstration, we use linkage mapper to do the opposite, to create corridors between actual focal areas for conservation. But I thought this was an interesting way to kind of flip that on its head and use it to guide development in a way that would cause the least impact to conservation goals in the region. Any other questions? All right, so the last demonstration project has a little more going on. This is for the Gulf Coast and Oaks and Prairies joint ventures. And the idea here was to identify focal areas, hotspots, and corridors for GRIP and CGRIP. And in this case, we're only looking at tallgrass prairie products instead of all habitats like we did with the previous products. For the focal areas, we wanted to identify 15% of the land area in each JV territory, with a minimum size for each area set to 50,000 hectares. For hotspots, we wanted to identify 10% of the tallgrass prairie extent within each joint venture territory and set minimum area requirements to 10,000 hectares. We chose 10,000 hectares for the hotspots because the Atwater's Prairie Chicken Recovery Plan recommends establishing a multitude of sites of that size or greater. We figured if it was good enough for prairie chickens, it would probably be good enough for other grassland species. And the map over here shows the dividing line between the joint ventures in red. And it also shows the Gulf Coast joint venture already has focal areas, these gray polygons down here, while Oaks and Prairie has a set of focal counties. Our approach was meant to drill down into these areas a bit, and also to see how selections made by our models compared to those already made by the joint ventures. So this time we download the management rankings for tallgrass prairie. Again, we have to mosaic because maintenance and restoration rankings are in separate rasters, but GRIP could be used for either objective. So we use that mosaic tool again to create a new raster that combines habitat restoration and habitat maintenance rankings. And both of those are included in that management ranking gallery. So when you go there and download the raster pack, you get both of them. They're just separate rasters that if you want to look at both things at the same time, you have to mosaic them to a new raster. We then calculated mean subwatershed rankings for this combined management ranking raster. Those rankings already exist for maintenance and restoration rankings separately, but not combined like this. So these three steps here are what we did to do that. It may seem like a lot, but it's not too much once you get used to it. Again, it's a zonal statistics approach. We create a table that just calculates the sum of each ranking for each subwatershed boundary. And then we join that sum field to an existing subwatershed boundary shapefile. And we calculate the mean ranking by basically dividing the sum over the number of reporting units in each subwatershed, but only looking at their land area. So we take the land area of the subwatershed divided by 40,000 square meters, which is the area of a single reporting unit. So seems like a lot. Again, all of this will be, so for one, this presentation is being recorded and will be available on our website. We'll also have a PDF of the presentation up on the website. And we also have a series of reports that were generated for each demonstration project. And in the next week here, I'm going to synthesize those reports into a single report and put it up on the website too. And it'll have all the instructions and details of what we did, as well as links to some of these tools in ARC. So if you're not familiar with that tool, you can all just click a link and it'll tell you how that tool works. We then displayed both layers by deciles, so categories of 10, to prioritize selection of focal areas. And this is what all that looks like. It's kind of messy, it's certainly ugly, but it's, for me, it was a really clear way of looking at this and trying to help guide selection of focal areas. And so what you're seeing here is the top 10% of subwatersheds are blacked out. These should comprise the core of our focal areas. And then beyond them, the top 30% of the reporting unit level raster, those 10-acre patches, the top 30% of those are shown in varying shades of red. We tried using an automated approach to identify these focal areas, but the results weren't exactly ideal. That approach works much better to identify the smaller hotspots, which is what we'll show you next. But for these larger focal areas, we selected the highest priority subwatersheds based on this map with our total area and minimum area requirements in mind. And this is what we ended up with for the Oaks and Prairie's joint venture. Incidentally, this is pretty similar to the results of the automated process, but without some of the kind of weird anomalies that included large patches of low priority habitat in that automated process. So we just weren't really happy with the results of that. So we went with this approach instead, which makes a lot of sense to me because ultimately, if you want to have this large regional scale planning, it makes sense to have things at a watershed scale. So selecting specific watersheds like this, I think does make ecological sense at least. And here's the guidance map for the Gulf Coast joint venture. You can see the Goliad, Refugio, and Victoria prairies should really make up the heart of grassland conservation within this region, though there are a couple of other key subwatersheds here out in the eastern portions. Here are the focal areas we ended up with for the Gulf Coast joint venture. So next, we created corridors between the focal areas using linkage mapper again. Because we're working at a much larger spatial scale here, we, to generate our resistance grid, we reclassified the management rankings raster into groups of 20 instead of 5. So that's what we're explaining here with the ventiles. So the highest 5% of tallgrass prairie is set to a resistance of 1, and then the next 5% is set to 5, next 5% set to 10, and so forth until you get to the the lowest rated 5% of tallgrass prairie, which gets a resistance value of 95, and then no data gets a value of 100. And so basically, this is just going to prioritize corridors flowing through high priority grasslands to connect those focal areas. We then ran linkage mapper and buffered the resulting least cost paths by 2,500 meters to create 5-kilometer corridors. So here's what the output from Linkage Mapper looks like. You can see the least cost paths in red and the broader zones of connectivity in a black to white gradient with black areas indicating higher connectivity. And then when you buffer the least cost paths by 2,500 meters, you get these corridors. We chose 5-kilometer buffers, again, based on the APC recovery plan, that Waters Prairie Chicken, which recommends that those 10,000 hectare sites be connected by corridors of 2 to 5 kilometers in width. Here we went with the higher end to connect these larger focal areas, but for the smaller hotspots, we used 3-kilometer corridors instead when we get to that. And the reassuring thing with these 5-kilometer corridors is they do include some of the best connectivity when you go back to this map here and look at those raw outputs from Linkage Mapper. Most of those highest connectivity areas around the least cost path end up included in those 5-kilometer corridors. And you can also see a lot of very high priority grasslands within there as well. So that's all reassuring. It seems like we have a good output here and a good network of focal areas connected by potentially viable corridors. For the hotspots, we use the same rankings raster as before, but this time we clipped it by the territory of each joint venture so that we could run the locate region tools in ARC separately for each joint venture. These are the specification we used for locate regions. For the Gulf Coast joint venture, we only identified 9 hotspots instead of 10. Because it would be difficult to impossible for ARC to identify 10 hotspots of 10,000 hectares or more while totaling exactly 100,000 hectares, which is 10% of the tallgrass prairie extent for the Gulf Coast joint venture. So basically, in other words, we just went with a lower number of regions here to make our minimum area and total area requirements mesh. We also separated hotspots by at least 5 kilometers. We use this highest average value evaluation method. There's a variety of different evaluation methods you can use, and we played with most of them. And highest average value is the default and seemed to work the best as well. So we stuck with that. This shape utility trade-off is basically just telling you how much emphasis it's gonna put on making hotspots that are in the shape you choose, in which we chose circle. We're not actually interested in that shape very much, so we have a low value here to prioritize higher quality areas instead of focusing on creating some shape. And we used Linkage Mapper in the same way again to generate corridors, except this time we buffered those least cost paths by 1,500 meters instead of 2,500 meters to create 3-kilometer corridors. Here are the hotspots and Linkage Mapper outputs for the whole geography. So this is combining the ones from the Gulf Coast joint venture and from the Oaks and Prairies. And you can see they generally follow the pattern of the focal areas, though there is some variation between the two approaches. For example, down here, this peninsula is left out of the focal areas, but there's a lot of high priority grasslands there, so they end up being designated a hotspot. And this is the 3-kilometer buffers around the least cost paths. We can also look at this for each joint venture separately. Here are the hotspots, focal areas, and their respective corridors for Oaks and Prairie. Focal areas and hotspots could be used to prioritize different types of activities relating to grip, or they could be combined like this to provide different weights to different areas when prioritizing grip delivery. So again, this is just a matter of end user preference. And we just wanted to do both to kind of show you different approaches you can take to putting our models to use. So depending on your goals, you may be more interested in the hotspot approach, or you may be more interested in the focal areas in light gray, or you might be interested in combining both, and places that are both a hotspot and a focal area might get a higher weight in whatever whatever system you use to make your decisions about conservation delivery. Or you could put emphasis on the corridors, or both, you know. So just giving you examples here of different approaches you can take and different things you can do. And if you display the GRIP focal areas, GRIP focal counties over this, you see the Oaks and Prairies joint venture apparently did a pretty good job of picking which counties to focus on. These match perfectly. We did not exclude this area up here in the northern section of the geography when coming up with these focal areas and hotspots and corridors. So it seems like this was a good emphasis for them to work on these counties, which is reassuring that we come up with similar results. And these are the combined inputs or outputs rather, for the Gulf Coast joint venture. And again, if you overlay the focal areas that the Gulf Coast joint venture had already come up with, you do see a lot of overlap here as well. There are some differences. This hotspot here is not included in their focal areas, as is this hotspot too. But this could be something that they could then use to say, okay, well, maybe we should put a little bit of focus here too. It's not in our official focal areas, but these are important areas we might be interested in doing some work into. And again, that overlap at a fairly broad level is reassuring that, you know, the tools we developed seem to be seeing things in a similar way as the joint ventures had done to prioritize their approach in the first place. So it's good to see that overlap. There's an extra step in this joint venture project I was going to share with you as well. But before we do that, does anyone have any questions on these focal areas and hotspots and corridors and everything?
Brian, this is Jim.
Hey, Jim.
Yeah, these maps look great. I like the overlap of the hotspots in the kind of selected areas, and how we were kind of envisioning this is being able to. Right now, we score our GRIP projects to pick out which ones to fund and which ones kind of need more work, and we were always envisioning that someday we would, instead of just the counties, we would pick places within counties, but the process of doing that was going to take a long time. So this is pretty cool to see, and hopefully we can figure out a way to work it into the system. We just now figured out how to do a scoring system like EQIP does, but for all of our RCPP projects, which has EQIP federal dollars built in with non-federal dollars, and to merge those two systems and have a scoring system that emphasizes prescribed fire is what we built so far. But putting a geographic component into the scoring system is kind of the next step in all of our kind of conservation efforts. So nice job, pretty cool.
Thanks. Glad to hear it's of interest. Does anyone else have any questions or comments?
I just had one quick question for you, Brian.
Oh, sure.
I missed some of the stuff earlier, so you may have discussed it already, but I was wondering how well you thought the, I guess, tallgrass prairie measure worked down in this area, because at least I know in like getting down in Gonzales and Karnes County, and I'm sure into the coastal prairie as well, sometimes parsing it out from shrubland can be difficult. I was wondering like what base information you used and how you thought it lined up with what we're actually seeing on the ground for that particular tallgrass prairie measure.
Right. So unfortunately, the remote sensing data that's available right now at the scale and resolution we need to create these models is not the best. Some of it's pretty good, but let's see. I'll go back to this real quick. All right. So we used indicators like woody cover, herbaceous plant community quality, and fire return interval to kind of give an idea of those vegetation metrics. Woody cover, we used a combination of approaches. So the first thing we used was the land fire metrics for woody cover, but they're not super accurate in our region, unfortunately. And so we still use them, but we combine them with kind of our own in-house made indicator of woody cover, which we used based on those, the Texas ESM, the Ecological Modeling System, or EMS rather. So the vegetation classes developed by Texas Parks and Wildlife, they're at a resolution of 10 meters by 10 meters, and it's pretty great data. And so we use that as an indicator too, because our reporting units are 200 meters by 200 meters, so we have quite a few of those 10-meter pixels within. And so anything that they classify as shrubland contributes to our calculation of woody cover within any reporting unit. So we combine that with the land fire woody cover to get our overall woody cover. It still seems to underestimate woody cover across the region, but it's the best we can manage right now. I know Texas Parks and Wildlife is working on an updated version of some of their products that I think are especially going to help with the herbaceous plant community quality. That's a really rough estimate based on those vegetation classes that Texas Parks and Wildlife has. So we took basically expert opinion throughout the planning stage to associate different vegetation categories of the Texas Parks and Wildlife classification to different levels of herbaceous quality. And so generally speaking, the coastal prairie and some of the sandier soil prairies were assumed to be of higher quality because generally speaking they are, but it's a very rough kind of estimate using that. We also included a map of prairie remnants just to make sure we were identifying places that are known to be high quality prairie remnants. And so that feeds into that herbaceous indicator. So we have that, and it's decent, but it's definitely coarse in terms of how well it identifies grasslands versus shrublands. And it's a fairly broad and general notion of what is tallgrass prairie. Is pretty inclusive. It includes a lot of land, a lot of territory. But those basically the lower ratings are going to go to those places that are more shrub invaded and lower herbaceous quality.
Okay, thanks. That answers a lot of questions that I had. Thank you.
Sure, and I actually wanted to add to that too. Part of that, so the uncertainty and kind of the, what's lacking with some of the remote sensing capacity with regard to doing these site level metrics is a big part of why we included human development and habitat amount and connectivity, because both of those things that are much easier to measure are themselves tend to be proxies for site level quality to some sense or another. And again, they're rough proxies of that, but they tell you something about habitat quality as well, and are often correlated with those things in some sense or another. So combining all three of these things together seems to give us a fairly good idea of where the better habitat is or not. Does anyone else have any questions before we move on to the last part of the demonstration projects? All right, so the Gulf Coast joint venture posed a question to us: if with a budget of $300,000, which grasslands would we prioritize for maintenance and restoration? They provided the specifications that basically giving a rough estimate that restoration would be about $350 an acre and maintenance would be $50 an acre. So to do this, first I calculated how much it would cost to restore and maintain all very high priority grasslands within the Gulf Coast joint venture focal areas that they had already identified, or at least the ones that fall within the scope of our project. So obviously we can't really do anything about the areas that are outside the bounds of it. For maintenance, that came out to almost 140,000 acres and at a cost of nearly $7 million. And for restoration, it was almost 130,000 acres and nearly $45 million. So there's something to aim for at a, at a very high level. But if we wanted to drill down and try and meet those budget specifications, what we end up with here is that if you put all $300,000 to maintenance, you could maintain the top 4% of very high priority grasslands, or 5,500 acres, which are all predominantly located within the northern reaches of the Goliad-Refugio Prairie down here. So basically all of the very high priority grasslands for maintenance are shown in light blue, and then that top 4% that we can actually afford to maintain on this budget are shown in dark blue here. And then if you spent it entirely on restoration, you could restore the top 0.5% of the very high priority grasslands within these focal regions, focal areas, which is 642 acres at a cost of $220,000. You could probably do a little more than that. Obviously, we're not meeting the budget, but just in terms of these percentiles, that was a rough estimate there at getting some areas identified. And here, they're shown in dark orange, which you can barely see, kind of along the San Antonio River here, where it crosses the Goliad-Refugio Prairie. So doing something at that scale is probably a little finer tuned than these products are really meant to work at. They're probably better suited to giving you an estimate at this kind of scale here. We're talking about millions of dollars and lots of territory. But you can, in theory, do this to see, even at the smaller scale where some of these highest priority 10-acre patches are at for using a smaller budget. Does anyone have any questions on how we came up with that?
Hey, Brian.
Uh-huh.
Was that meant to be an annual budget of 300,000 or just 300,000, no time span on it?
Yeah, he didn't give me a time span, so I think it was just a one-off thing. But yeah, we could, that would be the next thing you could do is take this over the course of so many years, $300,000 every year, and you could kind of have a time series of we do, you know, we maintain these 5,000 acres the first year. The next year we restore these 600 acres, and the next year we do the next step, you know, and you can kind of have that would create a whole new thing, which would be really interesting too. So that might be a little more informative over that time span then.
Yeah, because we plan over a 10-year time span. Our grid budget's been about 200,000 a year so far, but that doesn't include, you know, a lot of the equip dollars that we're now figuring out how to direct. So the budgets aren't that unreasonable. $14 million if you're talking about over a 10-year time span.
Right.
That's not too bad. 300,000 a year is not too bad, and if you could get it up to 4 or 5%, you know, over 10 years, that's 50%.
Right.
That's not too bad. It looks like big numbers, but they're definitely achievable, and this is cool modeling to put that piece together.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a good idea, thinking about it over the span of 10 years like that. That makes a lot of sense. And you can, when you think about it that way, you can think of how you can get from these smaller scale things to something larger scale like this. And especially when you're leveraging funds with various different organizations and also with private landowners and all of that. So.
And we're cheaper. We average about $20 an acre on our stuff.
Oh, you figured it out, huh?
Oh yeah, we track that.
All right, well, that wraps up the demonstration projects. Does anyone else have any more questions about the budget approach here before we move on? All right, so I kind of did question and answer throughout the presentation as we went through this. But if anyone has any other questions that are broader, don't apply to any specific thing, or even apply to your own specific project of interest, we can discuss that now. Again,
Ryan.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to ask, when you release the reports on the website, will you also be sending out an email? Because I definitely want to look at some of the nitty-gritty analysis you did in ArcMap or Linkage Map or all those other different programs you did, just for my own knowledge.
Yeah, for sure. So we're going to have another webinar next week, and it's going to be recorded as well. And basically, I'll probably just pick whichever webinar went a little better. And we're going to put that recording up on the website so you can actually sit through the webinar if you want to. We'll also have the PDF of this presentation up there, and we'll have that final report that's kind of a synthesis of the whole outreach process that we've been working on these past few months. And we'll go into great detail about each of the different demonstration projects and how we completed them. Like I said, all those reports kind of exist in their independent state right now, but we're going to synthesize those all. And yeah, I'll definitely send out an email to the whole stakeholder list, like everyone that was invited to these webinars will get that email. And then I'm also available, just if anyone needs to email me or call me or whatever, just get in touch with me. And I'd be glad to help you with any questions you have about the products themselves, or how to access them, or how to put them to use, or about any of the demonstration projects. And again, the user manuals are already up on the website. So again, if you go to that website I showed you in the beginning there, our main Edwards to Gulf LCD website there, there's a documentation tab, and you can look up all the documents. They have the final report, the whole conservation blueprint, which includes the strategies and all that stuff we did at the workshop. And then there's also the user manuals for ecological integrity ratings, because there's so much going on just in that one component of the models. And then there's a user manual for the protection and management rankings. And those go into really extensive detail. I try to put as much in there as I could just to make sure everyone knows exactly how all the data was processed going into these models and how it was all combined together to generate these outputs. Any other questions? All right. Well, if everyone's satisfied, go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you all so much for taking the time to sit in on this webinar and see what we've done and how to use these tools. I really hope they are useful for you all and that you'll be able to find some way to incorporate them into your decision-making process, and that maybe some of these demonstration projects helped you think about how you could do that. And again, just if you have any questions, please email me. Let me know. I'd be glad to help you out. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Great job.
Appreciate it. All right. Bye, everyone.